All right, joining us next on the show today, this big Friday edition of Steak for Breakfast. He's a retired U.S. Army colonel and government official, author, consultant, commentator, especially when he's here on Steak for Breakfast. Douglas McGregor, thanks for joining us on the show.
Oh, thank you.
Colonel, how's everything going on your end? It's been kind of busy times geopolitically. We've seen Ukraine has failed at their, I'm losing count now, fourth or fifth counter spring-summer offensive. You want to give us the latest on what you're hearing out of there?
Yeah, I think the latest is important because not too many Americans are getting the truth. I was surprised the other day the Daily Telegraph over in Great Britain published an article that for once was quite truthful and pointed out that the West is now staring at what they termed catastrophic defeat in Ukraine. And they went on to explain that, the Ukrainians have lost within the first month now more than 26,000 dead, thousands of wounded, along with 1,100 different pieces of equipment, tanks, armored fighting vehicles, trucks, you name it. They've also lost, as a result of deep strikes by the Russians, large ammunition storage depots, food, you name it. The Russians last night and the night before have annihilated many of the grain storage areas in and around Odessa. And this, of course, is because they finally decided to shut the port down because the Ukrainians were bringing ships in that were largely empty to pick up grain. Only they weren't empty. They were bringing in arms and ammunition. So the Russians said, enough's enough, no more nonsense. And this is going to drive up the price of grain, obviously, largely for Europe, but not exclusively, because Ukrainians are going to have to export entirely overland into Poland and up to the Baltic. And there are problems with that because many European producers don't want their market flooded with cheap Ukrainian products, whether it's sow bellies or grain or anything else. But the point is that the war has taken a very nasty turn now. And I really think that Ukrainians are facing disintegration. Their army is in terrible condition. I just published an op-ed that included an excerpt from a report that was released in Kiev that talks about the mass desertions that are occurring now on the battlefield. Units are giving up because they can't even evacuate their wounded. And when a commander can't evacuate his wounded, he has a choice. He can sort of sit there and watch all of them die because he can't really move his force, or he can surrender. And many of them have said, look, I'm not going to stand around and watch all these people die for nothing. So they've surrendered to the Russians. And the Russians, of course, have been smart. They've always treated surrendering Ukrainian troops very, very well. They don't abuse them. They feed them, clothe them, send them to decent facilities where they can be kept until a prisoner exchange occurs. And so people are not afraid to surrender to the Russians. So I think the whole thing is disintegrating. And I think that's one of the reasons you saw Zelensky treated as a sort of the redheaded stepchild at the Vilnius summit.
Sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was really interesting to see the way he was almost publicly shunned by all the people who have been, stuffing his pockets for the last 2 years now. And it seemed like a lot of the major world leaders that attended the NATO summit got out ahead early, talking about how they weren't going to be admitted to. I mean, Lloyd Austin almost joked about it, like, oh, can't admit them to NATO now. It would trigger a war. That guy has no idea what he's doing, but, at least for his memorized talking points for the focus groups, he was ready with the correct answer there.
Do you think Zelensky was being shunned because he wasn't adhering to the dress code again?
That's true. He did.
Well, he's always in costume, presenting himself as this battlefield commander, which, of course, is a joke. But, the larger problem is this, and this is what Americans don't seem to understand. Hundreds of thousands of people have been killed.
Sure.
Overwhelmingly Ukrainian, soldiers and civilians. We think between 350,000 Ukrainian soldiers are dead. You say that, and the Western media says, oh, no, that's not true, but the Russians have lost that many. Well, that's absurd. The Russians have taken very light casualties. There is no battle of attrition with who's going to lose the most first. That's already happened. Ukraine has been attrited. Mm-hmm. The tragedy here is that it needs to end because it's not going to get any better. The problem has always been the same. How do you build an army, let alone an armed force, on the fly? I mean, the Ukrainian army that existed at the outset was a little over 400,000, and that include reserves. Most of those men are either dead or wounded.
Yeah.
And so then you have to fall back on new armies. Well, new armies don't rise up quickly. They need institutions. They have to have leadership. They have to have training and organization. They have to have a systematic equipping program. You don't build an army out of a hodgepodge of equipment from 15 different countries. It's just nonsense. So this whole project is collapsing, and we're now at the point of desperation. And what we're doing in the meantime is lying, trying to convince everybody in sight something's real that isn't. That is that the Ukrainian state is real. No, it's dying. The Ukrainian nation is at risk of going out of existence. No one has the courage to stand up in Washington or London and tell the truth. This must end. Yeah, if for no other reasons, on the grounds of, humanitarian concern. And of course, then you have Europeans in Poland and Slovakia and Hungary and many other countries in Germany who are saying, we've got to end this thing and get these Ukrainians to go home, because virtually every Ukrainian that comes out says, I'm never going back.
Right.
Why would I go back to this hopelessly corrupt gangster state, where I can be further exploited? And then we don't even talk about the estimated 60,000 children that have disappeared from the planet coming out of Ukraine. And if anybody's seen the movie Sound of Freedom, it doesn't take a genius to figure out what's happening to these poor children.
Yeah.
It's just unthinkable, to say the least. And yes, I definitely agree with you. There's that component there. It's like the unspoken words that, only the reals will talk about, like yourself, Colonel. And then, when you see the way other stuff is kind of unfolding right now, there's been a couple other weird components of this. There was like the fake coup, and now the Wagner Group is kind of set up in Belarus. What do you think is the issue with that? And then, you mentioned Vladimir Putin a couple of times. He's really been posturing and saber rattling, especially the last 24 hours. He had a meeting with all of his government officials yesterday where he was talking about, Poland, maybe they shouldn't have some of the land that was gifted to them back in the day from Russia, and then started talking about how in years past, they did things to help break up different parts of Europe that they thought were historically and geographically not appropriate, like the Czech Republic and stuff like that. What do you think about those two things?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, the Wagner Group, one of the reasons for Prigozhin's behavior was to save the Wagner organization from destruction. Gerasimov, the chief of staff, and Shoigu, the minister of defense, had been doing everything in their power to effectively liquidate Wagner. They're sick to death of Prigozhin. I don't think they appreciated some of the things that he said publicly, even though many of them were true. So he appealed directly to President Putin and said, don't just liquidate us. We've done a good job. We're Russian patriots. And of course, inside Russia, Prigozhin and his fighters are enormously popular people. I mean, they're seen as Russian heroes who fought and bested, the Ukrainians at every turn, even at the great cost to themselves. So that's one thing. The second thing is that he was trying to get a message to Putin, and that is, look, these damn generals that you've got in charge are wasting time and wasting lives. We need to get this war over with. The Ukrainians are finished. Let's attack and end it. And I think that's what you're seeing now. You talk about meetings and saber rattling. I think the Russians now know that this thing called Ukraine is falling apart. This Zelensky government is a facade. The corruption, the incompetence, the squandering of resources, and worst of all, the squandering of human life in defense of what is really a sick, perverse regime in Kyiv have all caught up, and the Russians are beginning to say, let's get on with this. And at the same time, remember, they've got an offensive underway.
Yep.
It runs from the Russian border just opposite Belgrade all the way up to Liman and Slovyansk. And now there are a number of different ways that they can go. But there are two things to remember. First of all, they're meeting some tough resistance around Slovyansk, but practically nowhere else. And the Russians are moving very deliberately because, again, they don't want to take unnecessary casualties. And they're happy when the Ukrainians surrender because they're not really interested in killing more Ukrainians. I mean, these are Slavic Orthodox Christians, much like themselves. Why do they want to kill them? This is something that eludes us here in the West. We don't get it. The other thing is that they're not far from Kharkov, which is historically a Russian city. And like Odessa, it's been designated as one of those two major cities that the Russians will retake. So I anticipate that as they move their integrated air defenses forward, which eliminates any air threat and missile threat, and then secondly, as they adjust their strike systems linked to their overhead surveillance so that they can move everything forward and effectively blast out of existence anything that shows up in great numbers. As that happens, you're going to see them move further and further north and west. And eventually, I think you'll see them encircle Kharkov. I'd be surprised if that doesn't happen in August. And when it does, then I think the Russians will sit around Kharkov and wait for the last reserves of the Ukrainian military to attack them. And they'll